Are top laners going to be relevant again? What is going on with the tank meta? Make sure to stay tuned to find out. What up guys, and welcome to another ProGuides video. My name is Christoph, and we're going to be running through all the changes that have hit Summoner's Rift for patch 10.5. We're also going to provide you guys a tier list with all 5 roles, and as always, we're going to give you the best champions to play. Keep in mind, however, this is a fresh patch, and our tier lists are purely predictions. They are subject to change, and we'll definitely keep you guys updated in our mid-patch update next week. I want you guys to leave any comments or feedback down below, especially if you disagree with any of these placements. And finally, for our question of the day, should supports be viable solo laners? Think Soraka top lane. Think Sona top lane. Do you guys think they should exist? Personally, I do not. Let me know down below. And as always, if you guys want to get better at League of Legends, make sure to click that description link below and go to ProGuides.com. Find your challenger coach right now. They are waiting for you guys. What are you waiting for? Go get better. Go to ProGuides.com. All right, guys, let's get into the video. Before we run down the balance changes, let's talk about some of the skins hitting Summoner's Rift. First, we have Black Frost Alistar and Black Frost Renekton. Wow, these guys look pretty sick together. We also have Black Frost Rek'Sai joining the roster. I'm glad they've decided to expand upon this skin line because it looks pretty good. Also, Hextech Sejuani is now available. For all you Sejuani enthusiasts out there, you've got another crafting option available to you now. Alright guys, let's get into the good stuff. A ton of item balance changes have hit the server with patch 10.5, so let's talk about them. Titanic Hydra has had its damage increased to 5 plus 1.5% of your max health to primary targets and 40 plus 3% of your max health on secondary ones. Essentially, the damage has been increased by 0.5% of your max health. In the late game, most bruisers or juggernauts will have around 2,500 to 3,000 health. Sometimes they'll have even more. We're looking at roughly a 15 damage increase on every single basic attack. Given how tanky a lot of those champions are, or how difficult they can be to take down, it's pretty realistic to believe that they'll see massive increases in their damage output later into the game. Ravenous Hydra's lifesteal has been buffed from 12 to 18%, and the active radius has increased from 400 to 450. While the radius buff isn't that big of a deal, the 6% increase in lifesteal is actually pretty huge, especially because Ravenous Hydra allows you to heal off of its cleave damage as well. A buff like this is going to allow champions that build it to heal even more off of each wave. These are pretty big buffs, guys. Blade of the Ruined King will now deal 12% instead of 8% of the target's current health if you're a melee champion. This buff should incentivize more bruisers and melee carries to consider picking it up. With the rise of tanks, it makes sense that Riot is being quick to keep them in check, and Blade of the Ruined King is a great item to do just that. A change that I'm personally really thankful for, though, is that Spell Thief's Edge and Spectral Sickle will now only have their effects triggered if they have allies nearby. This should finally put an end to those solo laners building it, refusing to interact with their lane opponent in a healthy way, and yet coming out stronger than their enemies. This was a problem for me in the top lane. I know it was a problem for a lot of you guys there as well. Also, boots of mobility have been way too strong. This patch, its cost has been increased from 900 to 1,000 gold. I know that this sounds really silly, but you can't take this nerf for granted. Boots of mobility are an item that players will usually rush very early into the game. 100 gold might not seem like a lot 20 minutes into the game, but 5 or 6 minutes in, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, that's a lot. It'll be much harder for supports, mid laners, and junglers to first buy them now, as they'll need to farm a little bit more in order to purchase them. Okay, no surprises here, but Boots of Swiftness are still underperforming. They've had their movement speed bonus increase from 55 to 60. We'll see if this buff has any effect. Movement speed is an extremely valuable stat, but it's uncertain whether or not this will make Boots of Swiftness a more popular purchase. Turrets will also receive some changes this patch. Once again, taking a plate will now grant 160 gold instead of 120, but ranged champions will now deal 20% reduced damage to turret plates. Okay guys, let's jump into my favorite lane, the top lane. The top lane sees a couple of changes aside from the item changes. Ornn's passive Living Forge will now craft an item upgrade for himself at level 13 instead of level 12. He'll now be able to upgrade his allies' items at level 14 instead of 13. Essentially, he's had his passive pushed back an entire level. This nerf doesn't really matter in the late game, but can be a pretty big difference in the mid game. It's an effective nerf as it'll give his enemies a little bit more time to work with before the inevitable occurs, as in they die to Ornn. Ornn and teammates will end up a little bit weaker during the mid game as a result. On top of this, his W, Bellows Breath, is having its brittle damage decrease from 12 to 20.5% to 10 to 18% of the enemy's max health. In spite of these nerfs, Ornn will still remain an S tier pick. He's being bumped down from the S plus tier, but is still an extremely powerful pick, especially for those stats that he provides in the late game. Set's armor is being reduced from 37 to 33, his health regen from 8 to 7, and HP regen per level from 0.75 to 0.5. His ultimate's slow duration is also decreasing from 1.5 to 1 second. Overall, these nerfs should give players more options to counter him. His damage has not taken a hit, however, so he'll simply drop to the very bottom of S tier. He's on the cusp of A tier, but especially in lower elo, he'll remain a dominant pick because of how much damage he can dish out. Okay, I'm not happy about this one, but Neeko is being introduced into our top lane tier list because of the buffs she received this patch. Her attack speed per level is being increased from 3 to 3.5%. Her attack speed ratio is also going up from 0.645 to 0.6875. Finally, she's also receiving some buffs to her abilities as well. Her W will now deal 50 to 150 damage with a 0.6 AP ratio, and her R's shield is increasing from 50 to 150 plus 0.5 AP to 75 to 125 plus 0.75 AP. Overall, these buffs help Neeko out a ton as both an AD and an AP pick. She'll prove to be a powerful flex pick with many safe matchups. As a result, don't worry, she's not S tier yet. We'll be placing her in our B tier. Finally, Darius is once again receiving another jungle buff. He's already been dominating his competition, so we're bumping him up into the S plus tier. As a champion that's already strong enough to roll over his opponents, the increased damage to jungle monsters should just help him steal jungle camps more effectively than before. His passive damage to monsters is increasing from 120% to 175%. Oh god. This patch, like we mentioned, there will be some shifts around the S tier. Darius and Garen sit at the S plus tier. Nothing changed for Garen, but he's been an absolute monster on Summoner's Rift, and we heavily suggest picking him up. In Gold and below, he averages from 53% to just below a 54% win rate, while in higher elo, he still holds on to a 52% win rate. We're also going to be pushing Vladimir down to the A tier because of the various buffs to bruiser items. While Vladimir is definitely still an amazing late game pick, it can be very difficult to get there with some random skirmishes breaking out and ruining your laning phase. These little skirmishes in the mid game are going to be more common, as bruisers will see a lot more play this patch. There's a strong chance that Sona Top will be coming back, but we'll hold off on ranking her just for now. Our analysts guess that she'll be somewhere in the middle of B tier. Against tanks or lanes that she can free farm in, she'll still be the same annoying god of the late game. However, since Spell Thieves has been nerfed, she'll actually have to interact with her lane opponent from now on. Many matchups are going to get pretty dangerous as a result. Alright guys, with top lane out of the way, let's get into the jungle. We already mentioned the changes Darius received, however, these aren't nearly enough to make him a decent jungler, so he's going to be placed in the D tier this patch. Mordekaiser actually has been pretty close to decent, but he received another jungle buff this patch, increasing his passive damage to monsters from 25 to 120 to 28 to 164. As a result, he'll be placed in the C tier, as he'll do just fine. Poppy's Q is receiving a buff as well to non-champions. Its max bonus damage to non-champions is going to go up from 40 to 120 to 50 to 160. We'll need a little bit more data before we officially place her in a tier. However, our analysts estimate that she'll sit around the B or A tier. Kane's passive is receiving a significant change. Instead of having orb spawn rates increase at the 8 and 12 minute mark, the growth rate will now be smooth. Overall, this should increase the number of orbs he collects by about 3%. Also, his W's slow has gone up to 70% from 60%. Overall, these changes won't really affect his place in the meta too much. He'll still remain around the A tier. Amumu's ultimate is receiving a partial revert as its cooldown has been increased from 130 to 100 to 150 to 100. Toward the end of last patch, Amumu actually proved himself as an S-tier champion, but since he's received a nerf to keep him in check, he'll remain in the A-tier for now. He's definitely capable of making a push to the S-tier with his insane win rates, but we'll need to see how the meta develops, as his power heavily depends on which junglers are popular. The shorter cooldown on his ultimate might have been carrying him significantly, so he may take a bigger hit than we presume this patch. Just like Amumu, the double buffs Rammus received last patch were too much. All he really needed were those Cinderhulk buffs after all, so his attack speed is going to be reduced to 0.625 from 0.656. Just like Amumu, Rammus was destroying his competition toward the end of last patch. However, with these nerfs, he will remain in his previous spot in the B tier. Graves' MR has gone up from 30 plus 1 per level to 32 plus 1.25 per level. His Q's cooldown has gone down a second at all ranks, and his mana cost on it has been decreased to a flat 60 from 60 to 80. All of these buffs are a nice touch to Graves as they'll help him out a ton, especially against AP junglers. Overall, he'll still remain in the A tier because of his high skill ceiling, leading to some mediocre win rates and low elo. Alright guys, for our jungle tier list, our S tier introduces a new member with Warwick. The Titanic Hydra buffs are going to be a nice touch, and he was already dominating the jungle across all ranks without them. For the rest of our S tier, we have Elise, Echo, and Zac in the S plus tier, as well as Lee Sin, Olaf, Rek'Sai, Karthus, Shaco, Trundle, and Nunu sitting just below them. Jarvan is actually still a solid pick, but we're going to be placing him in the A tier because he performs just a little bit worse than the S tier picks. He's still a reliable, powerful champion, however, don't be discouraged if you've been finding success with him. Zed and Gnar have been placed in our D tier. Their win rates across every bracket show that they just can't compete with traditional junglers. However, there's a new jungle Zed build that's gaining traction. Make sure to subscribe, as we'll keep you guys updated on that build a little bit later into the week, as we need a little bit more time to let the meta develop on patch 10.5. Alright, that's it for the jungle. Now let's head into the mid lane. The mid lane has had a few changes this patch. First off, Lissandra is having her Q's ratio increase from 0.7 to 0.8. These buffs aren't enough to push her up a tier, and Lissandra will remain in the B tier. However, buffs are still buffs, and Lissandra is now on the cusp of making a push into the A tier. Just one more buff, no matter how small, will likely be enough for her to once again become a very powerful pick. Like we mentioned earlier, Neeko received some buffs this patch. Her AP builds also benefit from them, so she'll jump to the top of our B tier because of her immense crowd control. Neeko can heavily affect games with it, so these buffs should put Neeko in a pretty great spot to carry her games. The nerfs Ornn received this patch are going to hurt him a lot in the mid lane. By picking Ornn mid, you already sacrifice quite a bit in exchange for late game scaling. The fact that this scaling has been pushed back makes it much riskier to lock in Ornn mid, so he'll be moving down to the B tier. Our S tier remains unchanged. We have Fizz, Diana, and Qiyana in the S plus tier because of their insane burst damage, mobility, and roams. In the S tier, we have Kassadin, Katarina, Echo, Cassiopeia, Vladimir, Talon, Zed, and Yasuo. They all deal insane amounts of damage, either bursting down their carries or 1v9ing fights. Cassiopeia and Vladimir remain as the most prominent mages in the mid lane because of how hard they can carry team fights. The amount of damage they can output is just nuts, and they're holding their own weight, even in the current meta dominated by assassins. Okay guys, let's talk about bot lane. Guess what? The bot lane has the least amount of balance changes, but Kai'Sa received a lot of changes. Her Q's AP ratio has gone down from 0.4 to 0.25. However, she'll now shoot 12 instead of 10 missiles when it's upgraded. Also, her W's damage is being adjusted significantly. It'll now deal 30 to 130 plus 0.7 AP plus 1.3 total AD. Its base damage has gone up by 10, AP ratio increased by 0.1, and the total AD ratio decreased by 0.2. While this might be a nerf in many situations, its cooldown refund is going up from 50 to 70% as well. These changes, which are buffs, further solidify Kai'Sa's place in the S tier. Sivir is also receiving 2 buffs this patch. The first is that her Q's damage is being buffed from 35 to 115 plus 70 to 110% of her total AD to 35 to 95 plus 70 to 130% of her total AD. While it did lose base damage at rank 5, it's had its total AD ratio increased, so it'll deal more damage in practically every scenario. Her ultimate's minimum movement speed bonus has also increased from 20% flat to 20, 25, 30% based on rank. These buffs aren't enough to push her into the next tier, so Sivir will remain in the B tier. Our S Plus tier sees a change in the fact that Caitlyn has dropped to the S tier. In our S Plus tier, we still have Miss Fortune and Senna. In the S tier, we have Vayne, Ezreal, Lucian, Caitlyn, Jinx, Aphelios, and Kai'Sa. The reason Caitlyn has dropped is because of the changes to turret plating, which we mentioned earlier on. While they're more rewarding, they'll be a little bit harder to take. Caitlyn will still dominate her foes during the laning phase, but one of her biggest strengths was how reliably she could take first turret by herself. This is going to happen less often, which is why she's moved down just a little bit. Unfortunately, that's actually all we had to cover for the bot lane this patch, but we'll make sure to keep you guys updated for any changes to the meta in our mid-patch analysis video. So, as always, let's wrap it up with support. First up, Blitzcrank received a game-breaking nerf this patch. He lost, wait for it, 3 armor. So, this is not going to change anything. He's still going to lose his losing matchups a little bit harder, and the poke he takes will stick just a little bit more. But losing 3 armor alone will not change his placing. We all know why Blitzcrank is good, and it's because of that Q. Blitzcrank remains as an S plus tier this patch, and 3 armor is not going to change that. Bard also received a nerf this patch. His passive damage will now only increase by 12 instead of 15 for every 5 chimes he picks up. In spite of these changes, Bard will remain an S tier pick. He's lost a chunk of his damage in the late game, but his early and mid game damage is relatively untouched. The current trending build on Bard with a Deadman's Plate and Rapid Fire Cannon provide him plenty of damage, so he's still going to be just as effective as a pick. In a sense, this nerf is just a response to this specific build, and we expect Bard to still have a ton of agency over his games. Sona's nerfs have been reverted this patch. Her base AD is returning to 49 plus 3 per level, and her E self-movement speed buff is going back up to 20%. Those hotfix nerfs that hit her on 10.4 were just too much. They practically took her out of the game, which wasn't the intention at all. Hopefully the Spell Thief's edge nerfs are enough to keep her out of the solo lanes, because if they aren't, the balance team will likely have to take another look at nerfing her once again. As a result of these buffs, Sona is moving up to the A tier. She was proving herself to be a powerful support before she got nerfed, so she definitely deserves a spot there. Alistar received some huge buffs this patch as well. His base health is going up from 575 to 600, and his passive will now collect charges at all times, rather than only when it's off cooldown. This should give Alistar and his lane partner a lot more health to work with during the laning phase. It should also be easier to trade, stay healthy enough to trade, and survive tough matchups altogether. Alistar is an extremely influential pick because of how reliable his crowd control is. Also, he's extremely tanky, making him an excellent tower diver. He's moving up to the A tier this patch. Our S plus tier and S tier remain unchanged. In our S plus tier, we have Leona, Nautilus, and Blitzcrank. In our S tier, we have Thresh, Senna, Nami, Pyke, Morgana, Lulu, and Bard. A lot of these picks provide the necessary crowd control to take over games, and in our S plus tier especially, Leona, Nautilus, and Blitzcrank can literally win games off of a single pick. They're extremely powerful laners who snowball off of a single takedown. Other picks like Senna and Nami provide a ton of mid to late game utility, while also proving to be pretty powerful adversaries during the laning phase. We're also going to be dropping Lux down to the C tier. In spite of some buffs targeted at her last patch, her win rates have been abysmal, and she's going to need a lot more love before she commands respect in the bot lane again. Alright, that's going to cover our 10.5 patch rundown. If you guys enjoyed watching this video, then please hit that like button. Also, make sure to check out ProGuides.com if you want to see huge improvements to your rank. That's all for now, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the Rift.